Hi, my name is Kristen Angierski of Cornell, and I will be giving a fairly traditional conference paper about Tony Kushner's two-part play, Angels in America. So, queer theory and eco-criticism have not always gotten along. Eco-critic Greg Girard, for instance, argues that so-called antisocial queer theory uncritically embraces biophobia, which is the fear and distrust of the natural world. Biophobia is an understandable reaction to homophobia, of course. Ideologies of naturalness have been used to demonize queer people, and so it is unsurprising that queer theory and queer stories have tended to take place in the city rather than in the wild, so to speak. And yet, biophobia also leads queer theory down some dangerously nihilistic paths, which, according to Girard at least, undercut rather than bolster queer activist ambition. So Girard writes quite damningly of the temporal logics of no future, which is Lee Edelman's very famous, very influential articulation of the antisocial thesis. So Girard writes, quote, "No future, Lee Edelman's possibly unwitting extensio ad absurdum of queer theory, is a thoroughgoing rejection of the idea of the future itself. Edelman's central contention is that queers should accept the position allocated to them by their most vitriolic enemies as figures of and for the death drive, and reject the very idea of futurity embodied in the child. And they should never let that resistance to futurity ossify into anything like a political program, because that would betray the radical negativity of the queer," end quote. So Girard's sarcasm here, his sense of God forbid we do something, connotes his impatience, I think, with supposedly apolitical queer theory, the radicalness of which leads to a form of critical paralysis and activist paralysis, at the same time that it theorizes all of us into oblivion. So, while Girard problematically collapses the figure of the child with actual living, breathing children, I think his main point stands. The logical extension of antisocial queer theory in the Anthropocene is violence. So that is Edelman's fierce attachment to the now, if forced against his explicitly anti-programmatic wishes, would seem to advocate doing nothing. In short, humanity today is a geological force capable of self-annihilation. We might truly have no future. It seems the question is, what is the point of theorizing queer presentist oblivion when climate change might put an end to us as a species? And relatedly, the major question of this paper, what might be gained from queering the temporality of the Anthropocene, thereby conjoining queer and eco-critical thinking, specifically in my case through literature? So to begin to answer this question, I turn to Tony Kushner's very famous canonical two-part play, Angels in America, to begin to challenge the notion that queer theory and eco-crit should not or need not be in dialogue. So I argue most broadly that the play's representation of competing temporalities demands a merging of human and natural history. So Kushner collapses human time and earth time, fast time and glacial time, queer and green apocalypse by linking the temporality of the AIDS crisis to the temporality of climate change. Thus, queer life and queer theory are linked by way of Kushner's parallelization of queer and earth crisis. More precisely, my paper adds an eco-critical component um, to David Sevron's very influential reading of Angels, and adds a queer temporal dimension to Katie Hogan's perhaps less well-known eco-feminist readings of the play. So according to Sevron, Angels contains two competing temporal dimensions. First, we have the immobilizing time of the angels, and competing with the static angelic time is the time of progress embodied most fully by the character Pryor, who readers will recall we learn is dying from HIV/AIDS in the beginning of the play. So here I will suggest that there are more than two temporal systems at work in the play. and that each of these chronologics is articulated by way of environmental concerns. So a closer reading of the environmentalist dimensions of Angels in America ultimately makes it difficult to read angel time uncomplicatedly as static. Um, so ultimately, I read angelic time as deep time, or the multi-million year time frame within which scientists believe the Earth has existed. Thus, human and natural history, which have traditionally been understood to occur along radically different timescales, conjoin in angels and not merely metaphorically. So the Angel of America quite literally crashes into Pryor's New York City apartment, yes, but she also foregrounds the very real, increasing imbrication of human and Earth time. Accordingly, the play predicts the coming of the word Anthropocene, a concept which demands recognition of human beings as both biological and geological agents, whose existences can negatively affect something as large as an interstellar ecosystem, which is both terrifying and, as I will conclude, hopefully not entirely hopeless. Um, so, on my way to making this broad claim about the play's obfuscation of boundaries, I make two specific subclaims. One, that the character Harper is an ecofeminist prophet on par in importance with the character Pryor. And two, I suggest that the time of the angels is not static time, but deep time. And together, these claims support a reading of Angels in America as an ecofeminist drama of the Anthropocene. So, argument one, Harper is an ecofeminist prophet. So, Harper is a human character, I think, most explicitly linked to the environment in the play. She is, I would argue, the humanized version of the angels, who Savron, you'll recall, associates with stasis in contradistinction to progress. But is Harper really against progress in the play? Or is she and the angels against a certain vision of progress, a certain vision embodied by figures like Roy Cohn and Ronald Reagan in the play? So, to answer this question, I close read one of the opening scenes of the play in order to begin to connect Harper's eco-logics, as well as her eco-feminist refusal to succumb to denial, with the ecological vision of the angels and Pryor's celebrated progressive vision. So Roy Cohn, an attorney most infamous for his involvement in the McCarthy hearings, invites Joe, Harper's closeted gay husband, to move to Washington, D.C. This opportunity is very exciting for Joe, a Republican legal clerk and admirer of the Reagan administration. Joe, of course, has to ask his wife, Harper, first. Harper doesn't want to move. She claims she has things to do in New York and needs more time. Joe scoffs, quote, "You have all the time in the world." According to Joe, Harper, an agoraphobic, spends most of her time fretting indoors. Joe accuses Harper of needlessly and even hysterically delaying the progression of his career. So Harper is also a Valium addict, a drug which arguably takes her out of time. So Savron reads Harper's delay here and elsewhere as a sign of Angels in America's patriarchal center, its consistent degradation of femininity as a sacrificial lamb on the altar of progress. Quote, "As a result of this clearly delineated gender difference, femininity is associated with stasis and collapse, while a divine masculinity, God, is coded as being simultaneously deterministic and absent." Harper and the feminized angels are counterposed to that which the prophet Pryor, the play's hero, demands: movement, hope, more life. But this reading seems to me to ignore Harper's and the angels' own version of clairvoyance, as well as their very explicit ecological concerns, concerns which complicate Savron's binaristic reading of Pryor as progressive hero and Angels/Harper as backwards-looking, hysterical, feminine others. Note first that Harper, Pryor, and the angels are all compatriots in privileged seeing. If AIDS gives Pryor privileged sight, he can see and talk to angels, then Valium and possibly depression provides Harper with the same prophetic skill. Indeed, Harper and Pryor meet in several dream sequences, further linking rather than hierarchizing them. They both exist at the, quote, "threshold of revelation." Harper is also able to see into one possible future, a future dependent upon a series of possible acts and movements, marking her not as a figure of stasis, but rather as a seer who sees where plodding along on the same unchanging course might lead. One could even read the trope of Harper's delay, not as Kushner's othering of femininity as anti-progress, but rather as a push back against a certain vision of Earth and queer damaging progress. Um, so after Harper refuses to even consider moving to Washington, Joe makes his case for placing himself at the center of American politics. And in so doing, articulates an attachment to patriarchy, Reaganism, American exceptionalism, as well as indifference to environmental and his wife's concerns, all in the same passage, impressively enough. So he says, quote, "I think things are starting to change in the world. America has rediscovered itself, its sacred position among nations, the truth restored, law restored. That's what President Reagan's done," he says. "Truth exists and can be spoken proudly." So the rhetoric of change through the restoration of a mythologized American past should, I think, make any critic pause before arguing that this play is uncomplicatedly for Enlightenment-style progress. Surely this AIDS play is not celebrating the political effectiveness of Ronald Reagan, a man whose response to the AIDS crisis was infamously and tragically halting and ineffective. Harper's reaction to Joe's pro-conservatism speech reflects the imbrication of conservatism, anti-environmentalism, and patriarchy by way of denial and delay, by way of shushing. Harper disagrees vehemently with Joe's positive assessment of 1980s conservative America. For her, things seem to be getting much, much worse. Joe remarks that 6 years ago, the world seemed to be in major decline. Quote, "The world seemed in decline, horrible, hopeless, full of unsolvable problems and crime and confusion and hunger and," Harper interrupts, quote, "but it still feels that way, more now than before. They say the ozone layer is," Joe disrupts and minimizes Harper's eco-grief, telling her that she has, quote, "emotional problems because she stays indoors all day, fretting about imaginary," and here Harper interrupts Joe again, rejecting the claim that the expanding hole in the ozone layer, and thus also climate change, is imaginary. So Joe's denial in the play is therefore both sexual and ecological. His internalized homophobia, his denial about his own desire, translates in this scene into the denial of climate change and Harper's voice, thereby collapsing queer, feminist, and eco concerns. Joe refuses to hear about the hole in the ozone layer, um, whereas Harper demands to know. She says in all caps, I want to know what's going on." And it is this desire to know, I think, that makes Harper far more heroic and central to the play than critics have heretofore allowed. For it is denial, not feminized stasis, that emerges as the play's primary antagonist. Argument 2, the time of the angels is deep time. So even the most influential ecofeminist voice on this play, Katie Hogan, has tended to fall in line with critical interpretations that read the angels as symbols for stasis. She argues that the angels intensify their apocalyptic rhetoric at the end of the play, hoping to make Pryor stay in heaven permanently. This tactic fails. Quote, "Instead of accepting the angel's offer of eternal life, Pryor chooses Earth instead, where he, like all humans, will suffer and die, but where he continues to migrate, mingle, and move." This easy dichotomy of stasis progress overlooks the ecological vision of the angels, who seem highly invested in the continuance, the progress of the Earth itself. Ironically, then, this ecofeminist reading of the play misses the ecofeminist possibilities of reading the time of the angels not as stasis, but as time that moves so slowly, deep time, that it is usually imperceptible within the human experience. Dipesh Chakrabarty helpfully summarizes the challenge the Anthropocene poses to modern historiography. Quote, "Man's environment did change, but changed so slowly as to make the history of man's relation to his environment almost timeless and thus not a subject of historiography at all. No longer," Chakrabarty concludes. "In the Anthropocene, climate change becomes horrifyingly visible." The angels, unlike persistently illuminate the worst case scenario of climate change, they predict that humanity's obsession with an ecologically damning vision of progress will lead to the death of all biological life. Pryor's demand for more life is therefore more in line with the angel's vision than the critical conversation has allowed, for there cannot be more life if the earth isn't hospitable to that life. I think what critics may have underemphasized in their binaristic reading of the angels, stasis versus Pryor, mobility, is the fact that the angels also seem to be invested in progress, the continuance of the earth. I read the angels as figures of ominous warning who, through privileged extraterrestrial sight, can see what could happen if human beings fail to act, to move. They are thus precisely the opposite of what Savran contends. They do not necessarily demand stasis, but rather a different kind of movement that might derail Earth in queer damaging forms of progress. The demand of the angels is not don't move, but rather stop moving towards the Earth's destruction. This reading is only possible if one takes seriously the environmentalist dimensions of the play. So sitting in the council room of the Continental Principalities near the end of the play, the angels foresee humanity's bloody end. The angel of Antarctica is less than sympathetic to humanity's plight, understandable because she has probably experienced the most direct visible transformation of her vulnerable Arctic landscape. So Europa, Angel of Europa, says that hundreds, thousands of humans will die. Antarctica proclaims, quote, let them. Uncountable multitudes, horrible. It is by their own hands. I will rejoice to see it. Harper and the angels share an apocalyptic vision of eco-disaster. The angels mention Chernobyl, toxic snow, toxified drinking water, as well as the ozone crisis. And while it is undoubtedly true that Harper and the angels ask for a type of immobility at different moments in the play, it is crucial that the angels too are invested in progress. We were working, Africani echoes Europa. Quote, we were making progress. As demonstrated above, Tony Kushner's Angels in America prophetically foretells the rising specter of the Anthropocene and collapses the boundary between human and natural histories. My paper has meant to add to Savran's very influential reading of angels binaristic temporal dimensions that he claims map onto the play's troubling gender ethics. The stasis of the angels and hysterical Harper versus Pryor celebrated forward movement and progressive vision. Here I have shown how this interpretation underemphasizes the ecological dimensions of the play, as well as the thematic centrality of denial. Harper always demands to know. Joe refuses to know and dismisses, like many critics, Harper's worries about the disappearing ozone layer as the hysterical preoccupations of a female Valium addict. Joe's indifference to the ozone layer maps onto his internalized homophobia. Kushner thereby imbricates queer and eco concerns, suggesting that the ideological thrusts of Reagan-era politics involved a similar disregard for the natural world and for queer bodies suffering and dying from AIDS, a linkage supported by historical evidence of the biopolitical delay tactics of both the Reagan administration and present climate change deniers. So unlike Joe and Roy, Harper demands to know and represents a hopeful voice for the earth. Harper's eco-feminist vision of queer rapture, wherein AIDS victims, among others, rise up from the earth and become ozone, represents the merging of queer and environmentalist ethics in the play, as well as the collapse of human and natural histories. This sublime vision, while some dismiss it as a, quote, eco-feminist recycling project, unquote, seems to me the ultimate articulation of the play's ecological ethics and hopeful understanding of our collective, imbricated environmental futures. The angels, in contrast, as denizens of deep time, do not foresee hope. They see apocalypse, an escalation, a speeding up of the slow violence we have enacted on the earth. The angels are not then for uncomplicated stasis. They are for the continuation of the earth, which, even against their will, implies a caretaking relationship with humankind, for whom the earth, as Pryor says, is home. Thank you.